Hello, widowhood. Our conversation today is with Mr. Kevin O'Connor. He is the author of Two Floors Above Grief. And it's like, what is that about? No, it's not a self help book. It's not the steps of grief. This is a book that Kevin is sharing about his family and their experience of living above the funeral home. I know, right? Unique. Let's get into the conversation now.
Many people talk about the ups and downs of married life, but no one really prepares you for life after your spouse passes away. Welcome to Widowhood Real Talk with Tina, a safe place for widows, widowers, and their friends and family to talk about love and loss. Find comfort as you listen to honest conversations between Tina and invited guests who've experienced the loss of their forever partner. Share their stories of love, grief, and healing. You are not alone in this journey. Join today's episode and discover a wealth of resources and learn how to connect with others who are traveling the same path. This is Widowhood Real Talk with Tina.
Hello, widowhood. Our guest today is Mr. Kevin O'Connor, and I will let him introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Kevin O'Connor. I'm the author of a book, Two Floors Above Grief, and I'm thankful for this opportunity to be talking with Tina. And we'll talk more about the book and some of the premise of the book as we get into our discussion.
Very good. Thank you. So, Kevin, before we get into like the book, which is still sort of part of who you are, where are you from originally?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm much more than the book. Although the book it's a memoir about my life. But I currently live in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Have been here since 2007. Uh, Prior to that, I was involved as a teacher and school principal in California in the Bay Area, and in outside of Chicago in McHenry County. I was a principal there for 18 years, and then came here in 2007 after I retired from the Illinois system, and did some volunteer work and helping here and there. And before I knew it, I was by 2011 or 2010, I was working full time for the school system again. So I spent another 8 or 9 years working in the Department of Diversity in Broward County Public Schools in Fort Lauderdale, and my job there is in the curriculum area, working on curriculum and support for LGBT students and families, and also heavily involved with the writing and the professional development for the family life curriculum, sexual health curriculum that had been provided to the students in Broward County Public Schools. But I retired there in 2020, and then that's when I started. Okay, now's my time to write this book I've been wanting to write. So I started, I worked in the Biden campaign first. So after I retired in August 2020, I went right from there into the working as a field organizer for the Biden-Harris campaign. And then maybe in the start of 2021 is when I started to really focus on giving the book some legs and getting going with the writing and things. So that's where I was at, and a little bit more
Oh,
about me and where I came from.
thank you. There is so much there. I'm not quite sure where to jump in, but one, I want to be clear that he said near the Chicagoland area, which is totally different than being from Chicago.
Oh yeah, yeah, you're in Chicago. Yeah, I
Yes.
grew up in the that gets back to the book a little bit. Location of the book is mostly set in a town called Elgin, Illinois,
Yes.
which is about 35, 40 miles northwest of Chicago. And that's where my dad and my uncle operated their funeral home. My mother and her family had been longtime residents of that town, back to my grandfather. And my mother was raised there, and she and my dad met in high school there in Elgin. And so I was very much a part of Elgin till I went to college back in Chicago, Loyola, Chicago, and then spent a year of those 4 years in Rome, Italy, at their campus in Rome. Eventually, after being an educator in California for 6 years, I came back to the Elgin area in 1978 and ended up I was employed in McHenry County. So I worked in McHenry, Illinois as a teacher, and then I worked in Cary, Illinois um, as a principal. I was also a principal in Mundelein, Illinois, which is in Lake County. So these are all on the northwest collar of Chicago, and that's where I retired from in 2007. Was the school district in Cary, Illinois, and then I raised my family. I was married at the time with 2 kids. I raised my family in Crystal Lake, another town in that area.
Okay, so I have to ask the obvious. The cat over there, what's the cat's name?
Oh, it's actually a dog.
Is it a
She's
dog?
pretty well.
Oh.
It's a dog. It's a Chihuahua. Thanks for
Oh,
asking.
it's so small.
Uh,
Okay.
so small. She weighs about 11 pounds, and yeah, you can't. She's sort of bundled up in her blanket there. Yeah, she keeps me company quite a bit, and she had her morning walk, which is we have to temper those a little bit because now she has a congestive heart condition,
Hmm.
so she takes a lot of meds, and we know her time is coming, but we don't know
Oh.
when. Who knows? That's part of what I talk about in the book. There is no schedule, but we're doing what we can to keep her comfortable, and she spends a fair amount of her time in the position you see her in now, just
What was her
finding a little.
name? I didn't catch it.
Her name is Rosie. Rosie.
Rosie.
She was a
Okay.
rescue dog that we got about 5 or 6 years ago.
Okay. And who is we?
Mm, good question. We is my husband Leon. He and I met. Well, we've been together. We met 18 years ago. Excuse me. And then we've been together since about that time. I moved to Florida 16 years ago, 2007. Yeah, getting my math going here. And then but between us, in his marriage, he had 3 sons. And in my marriage, I had 2 sons. So we consider that we have 5 sons between us. And then we have 7 granddaughters who range in age from almost 5 to 22. So our family keeps us pretty busy, pretty grounded, and pretty involved. So that's the we in the statement. So
Thank you. So a couple of things, if you could unpack a little bit. How do you see being in education formed your life?
great. Well, I think part of my experience in the funeral home informed my decision to get into education. When I was a student, undergrad student, I took electives in education, not knowing that I would pursue it as a career. I was actually a political science major, and but that got me intrigued. And then when I moved right after graduation, I moved to the San Francisco area, and I was dating a college friend at the time named Sue, and was pursuing an education degree at UC Berkeley. And this was at UC Berkeley at the time, in California at the time in the 70s. They didn't have an education undergraduate degree like we would have been familiar with in Chicago or other places. You had to go what was called a 5th year, a credential year. So me coming into the state with a bachelor's in poli sci, and then I worked at the Bank of America for a year, and then I decided I really wanted to pursue this education thing. So I did. I spent a year getting my credential, getting intern teaching, student teaching, and then getting a job and working there for 4 years. So I think the frame of your question was, how did what inform my education?
How did working in the educational field form your life?
Oh, form my life. Okay. Oh, okay. Working in education, I just really, I went all in when I got my jobs and just opened myself to whatever I could learn. I moved right into from my credential year. I was working in a town called Vallejo, California, which is north of, in between, close to Sacramento, north of Oakland. Um, so I worked there for 4 years, and I was still involved with the university work at UC Berkeley, and decided I was just going to work towards my master's and got that. And that informed me in such a way that I really wanted to take a look at and be involved in more of a developmental approach to education, knowing that kids didn't learn. We structure a grade level system for them, but that's not really the way they learn. so in the way I approach my teaching. So I was hired in a student taught and was hired in a school that was in Vallejo that was all focused on what they call, many still call, multi-age education. So my first teaching job was kindergarten through third grade students, 32 of them all in the same classroom. And but that was the philosophy of the school, and I had learned and picked up on it while I was student teaching there, and got really immersed in that over those 4 years that I worked there. And that became it became a guiding perspective as I when I moved back to Illinois and got other teaching jobs. Even though I was assigned oftentimes as a grade level teacher, I always kept that in mind that we I didn't, I thought I maybe learned as I went through. I learned this in first grade and this in second and this in third. But as I worked with kids and other people in the profession at the time and took more and more professional classes, I became more and more intrigued with the theories of Piaget and other people who said, yes, we may learn in a developmental sequence, but the timing of that development is different for everybody. So that's part of what informed me during education. And as I went to other classrooms and positions, I kept that philosophy in mind, and I shared that with my colleagues. When I became a principal, I worked to institute in our school district and get people interested in the concept of multi-age education. Was able to, for a period of time, offer those options in our school district. And that was an exciting time for me because I felt like the thinking I had had as a youngster, young teacher, were coming full circle, because now that I was in a leadership position, I could work with people and give them those options, whether they be parents or teachers or kids. And we were able to, for that system was still in play when I retired in 2007 in varying degrees. So that kept me informed, and is that part of my philosophy has always kept me informed about learning and how we not only how we learn as children, but it's true of adults. And so, as every time I would teach a class, a college class, or teach classes or professional development in our districts, I just kept that in mind that adults are like kids. We're not all going to learn in a way that we think is prescriptive. We're going to learn through different our own way, and it might be a developmental thing, or it might be just what we're willing to learn at the time, or what our experiences are. But it's not lockstep. It's not anything that we can say, you're going to learn this in first grade because this is what you told you were going to learn in first grade. It doesn't work that way. And even though now, our country is still pretty much structured on a grade level system, I know that teachers in those classrooms still have to work within those parameters. How do kids learn, even though they're assigned to a particular grade level? What are their differences in learning? I could go on and on, but I think
No,
that's my educational thinking, and some of the things I'm continue to work on with people that contact me, or ideas I have for other writing, or committees I end up serving on, things like that. It's still part of my background, my philosophy and education.
okay, thank you. So you retired once and then returned to the education system. I'm interested in hearing the type of impact you think you made with the diversity program and the LGBT framework that you were a part of.
Oh, great question. Thank you. I love that work. And I got into it just by this time I had come out, I had moved, I had found some resolution in my own family with my spouse and my kids, and I was much more free and willing and wanting to be my authentic self. And so some of the volunteer committees I was getting involved with, and volunteer work I was getting involved with here in Broward County, had to do with groups that were advocating for LGBT students and adults. And that led to people recommending me to inquire about doing it, combining my education background with my interest in that. And that's the name of the department that I was had at that time was called Diversity Prevention and Intervention. And so when I was hired there, I first went as I was hired in different capacities, part time and then full time. but I readily got involved in the people that were doing the work with LGBT advocacy work, and got involved in. We decided to write what we called a critical resource guide for LGBT youth, and it was really designed for the teachers, but it became we worked with the ideas that have been promoted by the San Francisco education area and diversity department, and then we put together our own our version of that with the school board approval at the time, and then we put together plans to educate staff and to get them included in the importance of this work, and how to use different types of language. At this point, fast forwarding, to get to touch a little political stuff.
Just a
That,
smidge. We're not going to go too deep because I saw where that could go, but we're not.
no, I'll just mention, it's
Okay.
almost, even though the book right now is sort of on hold and the programs are on hold, I have with what's going on in the state of Florida, I'm convinced that the writing and the ideas themselves are not gone. They're there, and there'll be a
Good.
place where there'll be some sort of a phoenix. And I sort of take a little bit of pride in the idea that some of our uh, not approving government officials have used our critical resource guide in their talks about what's wrong with schools
Hmm.
and what's wrong with what we're doing. And so, of course, I take the opposite viewpoint. But if that book itself has gotten that much recognition, not only from the book that we wrote in our district, but other Florida districts, then we've made an impact. We've been
Hmm.
influential, and there's people that turn to that document and other ones to seek assistance and to seek ways to go. So I think that when I think about the work we did, and then the other part of the work was helping teachers educate their students about family life and sexual health, and how do you talk about it, and how do you not keep it a secret. How does a family, how does a teacher talk to the students about what's going on with their bodies, and how do they do that in a comfortable setting, and how do they do it with kids to make it just it's part of life, it's part of what you're experiencing. We don't want it to be fear based or anything like that. So that too, that program too is sort of it's there. It's sort of under wraps right now, but again, I based on that program is admired around the country. I was had the pleasure of speaking about it in other states and other school districts, and um, to know that it made that kind of influence, it was a good capstone for me in my career to say, "Hey, I am making a difference." So that's how I value not my whole educational career, but though that last aspect, answering your question, what was it like
Mhm.
to work in the area of diversity and things for LGBT families and others?
Thank you. And speaking of family, I can't help but admire all the pictures that are behind you.
Uh-huh.
And my thought is many of those people are part of the book. Am I in
Mhm,
the right
mhm.
line or how do
Oh,
they?
yeah. Here, let me grab a couple, okay?
Okay, yes.
Yeah. Well, the one picture, a couple pictures. These pictures are both in the book. This one, that's a picture taken around 1953, I believe. Um, with my older brothers in the back there, and I'm in the front there with the darker hair. My brother is a year younger than me. He's to my side, and that was taken. I think I'm about 3 years old, and
Hmm.
so there's a 9-year difference between my older brother and me, and then my younger brother and I, just a year difference. And then the other picture I have on that shelf is this picture that was taken in 1981, and incredibly, as I look back, as I get myself involved with other families, these are there's one more photo, uh, but these are really the only two. These are the only two that my family took with just the five of us. So, and I think part of that's a virtue of just not as we didn't use cameras like we do now.
Yes.
Part of it is just the idea that I guess part's mostly to do with we didn't use cameras like we did now. And then later, I got a glare of the sun here. This is a picture. Well, and that's my dad died in '84, but as adults, my brothers and I always made time to do things with my mother and take pictures. So this is one of those
Hmm.
pictures.
Bring it to the
And
other direction. Kevin, bring it. Yep, right there. No, no,
uh
back where you were for
there we go.
me. There
Oh,
you
it's
go.
pretty. There
Yes.
we go.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
that's myself. I think that's probably around 84 in the 90s, early 90s probably. That was
Okay.
probably there. And then this picture is sort of the most recent one on that shelf. And this is in the last chapter of the book. I talk about how my son bought a house in St. Paul that's very similar to the house
Yes.
that's the featured house in the book on the cover there that you have. And so it was when
Hold
he
on.
got
That's the house your son purchased, or this is the house that you
no,
grew up in?
here's the here I'll do a comparison. Here's the house I grew up in on the cover of the book.
Yes.
Okay. And my son 2 years ago came across this house.
Wow.
He wanted to get into real estate and have something that he could have a place of his own and also rent. So this particular house was built the same year in St.
Mm.
Paul as this house. This coincidental as this house was built.
Okay, I see the difference. But on
Yeah, and
its
I just
initial look, it's like, wow, what a similarity.
yeah, they are. And as I say in I think it's in the last chapter of the book, is as I was writing the book, 2 years finishing writing, I was at this house in St. Paul with him. You could see we've got construction gear in our hands and stuff. And it's my brother and it's my husband and my son on one side. The other side is my brother who's a contractor. So he came up and helped out, and we spent 2 or 3 days knocking into walls and things like that and building front steps there. Um, as I was doing that and getting into this old plaster and lath type structure, I thought, well, must be what it was like for my dad and my uncle when they first bought the house in 1938 in Elgin and converted it from a family home into a funeral home. So as I was picking around plaster and I thought this must be what it was like for dad. So I really felt like I was sharing that with my son,
Hmm.
and it was a good way to close the book too, I think,
Yes.
because it shows how families continue in their stories and how
Yes.
sometimes by plan, sometimes by happenstance. This one more by happenstance. So it's been an interesting um, twist. I'm not even gonna call it a twist. It's just a
Just
continuation,
full circle.
full
That's the way
circle.
things go.
Yeah. So those are the pictures. Some of the pictures I have kept. Thanks for asking. Those are some of the pictures I've kept on those shelves, just to keep me grounded into our stories. But yeah, like you said, those pictures do show some of the elements of the stories that are in the book itself.
So let's get into the book. And thank you for sharing those pictures.
Yeah.
In the introduction, I want to read something. It says, "We live in an environment considered funeral." I was like, interesting. I convert the word into an adverb, funerally.
Hmm. Hmm.
Amidst the wakes and funerals being conducted in the first floor funeral home, we did have moments, days, and years of joy, fun in the apartment where we lived on the second floor, second and third floors. And it just made me think about how much death and life is intertwined. We often don't want to think about death, but it is reality that we have to
Hmm.
consider. And
Hmm.
it also made me think about how, in that person that is grieving, death and joy can coexist.
Hmm. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Um,
I'll let you take it from there. Your thoughts on that introduction. I won't hold
Well,
you.
yeah, yeah, and I thanks for reading from the book, and I enjoyed writing those words. And when I was making up, I don't think I made it up. Funeral, really, funerally. It's not a word that we use very often in the funeral home, but it seemed to fit like an adverb for how our life was.
Yes.
It was an adverb that went along with whatever verb we might have been doing. We're having a party upstairs, sort of funerally, because there might have been a wake or a funeral going on downstairs. So there was that, or I might be, watching TV or singing or dancing upstairs, but still, it was sort of in. And I had sometimes as a kid or as a teen, I would have to stop and think. in living in my own home environment, hey, wait, there's a funeral home downstairs.
Yeah.
Because our apartments were certainly connected in many ways, but they provided a home like anybody would have a home. If I had taken one of those apartments and just put them in uh, use the same footprint and built a ranch house, it would have been a place to live and with a family. So when I was writing the book, what I wanted to do was to show um, two floors above grief that there was certainly grief going on with the funerals. And at one point, I talk about there was probably, let's say, if Dad and Uncle Lawrence they might have had 50 to 60 to 70 services or funerals in a given time, which would equate, based on the average number of people that came, there could have been 12,000 people that walk through the house on the first floor in any given year. And as I say in the book, how many of my friends had 12,000 people come to their house in a year's time?
Mm.
And but it was just that was just what was. I didn't know much different, and yet the thing that I've learned since I wrote the book and listened to and appeared on some podcasts that are part of the funeral industry, I've learned some of the more stories about the background of embalming and preparation and things that funeral directors and undertakers encounter when they come to a death scene. And some of those that I listened to and heard about were stories that my dad and uncle never shared with me, and I think that was purposeful. Um, I got to assume that they had similar experiences to what I've learned on some of these podcasts, but they kept that they kept that part of their professional lives separate from their family life. There's this chapter in the book about the death of when I was 14. One of my classmates died very suddenly. We just graduated from 8th grade in June, and in August he died. He had a sudden death with electrocution, and I convey the story in the book about how my dad got off the phone and told me what had happened. And this is a kid who I played with, and he walked my paper route with me sometimes and did things like that. So he told me, but it was just in the very early stages. And my inclination at the time, as I recall, was I wanted to call my friends and I wanted to tell them and share the news. And he said, no, just wait. Just wait. Let me learn a little bit more about it, and there'll be time to do that. And but that was part of what his thinking, his values were. That whether it was my friend Francis or whether it was any family that was coming to the funeral home, he didn't want to put his kids in a position or even have us have the information that we would sort of talk among our friends. And that was out of respect for the client and the family. And I'm not even sure how much of information he may have shared with my mom or my aunt. That those kind of things were something my dad or my uncle kept between themselves
They kept it
and their
private.
family.
Yeah.
Private. And and again, I hadn't really given that much thought until as I was growing up in it, or I just knew that I knew the funeral home was there. I knew I walked through it. I knew I helped out and did different things, but I didn't necessarily know many of the details. People ask me, "Didn't you ever go to the embalming room?" No, that was just an off limits. I make a couple mentions in the book where I was,
Yes.
"What are you doing downstairs here? Why are you here?" And I might have been going to pick up something else that was in the basement. You got to go upstairs. And so there was never that issue. And I'm sure as I got to be older in my teens and 20s, if I had asked, or even they might have said, come and watch, but I really hadn't expressed any interest in the business itself. I
Right.
dare say that they wouldn't even have done that if I had shown an interest, because they would have waited. You said, you'll learn about that when you go to school. We don't want to jeopardize you're not an employee, you're a child.
And
You're
I
my
think that
son.
that part right there, the idea of letting a child be a
Mm-hmm.
child, because
Mm-hmm.
some of those things you don't get to divert from. They will happen eventually. So that was a gift that your dad and your uncle gave you
Yeah,
to be able to do that. I want to talk about two more things in the book, and then I'd like for you to talk about what the book is about, the formation. I know we've been talking about it, but I want to give you space to talk about how you came to write in the book and the things involved in it.
sure, sure.
What I think is really interesting is the family tree that you lay out
Mm,
between your mother's side and your father's side,
mhm.
and just breaking that down and
Yeah.
giving to something that you just said. And I'll read this before you talk about the book and its development. How did I live in an apartment above a funeral home? Simply, I did not know any differently. I imagine my brothers and cousins have responded in like fashion. Becoming funeral home children happened at that moment of all of our births. I
Mhm.
think that's a good segue for you to talk about the book and its development.
Well, thanks for bringing that in. Yeah, that's pretty much one of the opening chapters of the book. And I think I said to even prior in our talk today, I didn't know any different.
Right.
And I even poke a little fun there in that paragraph to say that conceivably I was conceived,
Correct.
in that
Birth.
building.
Yep.
I was conceived in that building as probably where my brothers and my cousins in the prior location, the funeral home. But yeah, we don't know that. I never asked my parents that. Of course, who
Yeah, we're
does?
just going to make that
But
assumption. Yes.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I was conceived in the same house that people were having the formal exit to their lives.
Yes.
Um,
Back to that
uh,
circle that life is
well,
happening
then
while.
there's another mention in the book about my dad about how we helped out and how my brothers and I helped out in the funeral home and how we did different things. And one of the stories I mentioned was in 1960, in the mid 60s. My older brother was married and had four children, and one of their births might have been the birth of his first or second child in 63 or 64. And anyway, um, my brother had informed my father that um, he and his wife were on their way to the hospital. Concurrent with that, or just a bit after that, my father got a call on the phone. We called it a death call that said that he needed to go to the hospital to pick up a body who had passed. And so he got to the hospital and
The same
he went to the
hospital your
room,
brother was at?
the same hospital.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. We only had two hospitals in our town. And this, my brother happened to be at the same hospital as my dad drove to. So he got to the room where the deceased was and realized that the deceased was heavier and he really couldn't do this on his own to get the body onto the gurney. So he thought, oh, I've got some help here. do I dare? Do I dare go ask my son? So as I convey in the book, he walks, he knew his way around the hospital. Dad knew where all the wings were. He walks down to the father's
Maternity.
waiting room.
Hmm.
Remember in
Oh
1962,
yeah, back
father
then.
fathers
Yes.
didn't, yeah, they didn't go into the birth room or anything like that. That was so he walked into he figured where my brother was and he pushed the door open and he goes, psst, psst, Barrett, Barrett, Dad, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? I'm he says, hey, you got a couple minutes? I could use your help with what? And then my dad explained to my brother, yeah, I think I can get away. So I think this particular man's room might have even been on the same floor as the maternity room. I don't know. But anyway, he walked with my brother. They went down and my brother, this making what we called a removal was not, my brother was no stranger to that. He knew how to help. So he did and helped my dad and walked with my dad with the gurney down to the hearse to load the car up. And they gave each other a hug. Dad said, I love you. And he went back upstairs. My dad drove home. And by the time my dad got home, maybe 10 minutes later, the phone rang and it was announcing the birth of his grandchild. So, I mean, it was that circle of life. So dad was, and my brother were helping another family with their period of loss and transition, while at the same time our family was experiencing the birth of a newcomer. And then that was just part of what happened, what I was surrounded by oftentimes in my life. That and the way I think that my dad and my uncle and their wives, my mom, my aunt, you know, inculcated that sort of culture into our family, that this is just what is. This is certain families we knew, certain family, and if we knew them, of course, we felt that grief a little stronger. Um, but that's just what it was, and how the funeral home evolved, and how we incorporated our lives with it, and that's pretty much what the book's about. It's more, people will pick up the title and they'll say, "Oh, this is the self-help book I've been looking for." With the idea of being grief, and I said, "No, well, you'll get some stories that involve grief, but it's not a step. It's not a one. Like Gary Sturgis or some other readers, people I've been following, how they do step by step or incident by incident process. And how have you done? As I've listened to some of your things too, with your guest, how you talk to people about how do you get through a situation? How do you make that part of your life? So the book doesn't do that. I think some people might, and based on some of the reviews, people do take that away, and I'm happy about that. But the book, when I wrote it, was more the idea of how does growing up in a funeral home, how do we live, and pretty much what I wanted to say in the book. And the more I wrote, the more I was convinced of that we didn't live a whole lot differently than any other family. And I had plenty of friends who's also lived in the home of their family ran a business, whether it be a plumbing business or a printing business, and they lived to the side or upstairs and incorporated the business into their family. So I knew that just from the other friends I had, and certainly I I had friends that played at my house and stayed overnight, and I did the same with them. So all of that was very much similar to what a lot of families do. And part of what I wanted to, when I wrote for an audience, not only my own family, but when I was writing, I was thinking of the audience, that I wanted to tell these stories that our family, even though people that, oh God, you lived in a funeral home. Yeah, but I want to normalize it too. That it was my parents, my family's chosen profession, just like another friend's father was a doctor or a pediatrician, so it's just um that's part of what I was working to come across, with just telling family stories, and how my
So
cousins
how
and
did you
I
come across the family stories to share is also a part
ah
I wanted you to bring out.
thank you. Well, a lot of them were in my head. People have asked me, how long did it take you to write this book? I said, well, about 73 years. Because that's what I am this year. But I think the other treasure I had um, was a collection of family letters. And the book is based on and has a lot of foundation in 700 pages of family of letters that had been collected and saved over the years, mostly from the time period of 1968 to 74, 75, around in there, when I was away at college. And what I point out in the book is, in those days, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have the immediacy that we have now. And in fact, we didn't even use the phone that much, even though we can make long distance calls. Calling from Elgin to Chicago was considered long distance. And in our family's eyes, it was expensive. So, and it was, I think.
And I'm just gonna
So,
jump in there. So I was born in '66.
okay.
That's like collect phone calls and
Hmm.
what that looked like, the idea of calling somebody. There was a long distance call, like calling out of your state. Those fees applied. So the idea of just being able to have a cell phone and just pick it up and to call anybody anywhere was just like the Jetsons compared to when we
Ah,
grew up as far as that was a thing. I mean, I remember pay phones that you
pay
go to make
phone.
a phone call. I was stationed in Korea for 18 months, and my
Oh,
late
yeah.
husband, him calling me, we were still dating, and seeing that phone bill when it came across as far as what those calls looked like then, trying to maintain that relationship, so different than what people are experiencing now.
Oh, it is. And what I try to point out, and I have fun this week, I'm not sure how Amazon does all its analytics, but I'll take this one. The book was listed as number 9 for teens and young adult readers. And
Interesting.
yeah, and so of course I'm going to use that as part of my marketing now. But
For
um,
sure.
yeah, but I think the lessons I tried to convey in the book to explain to my children, my nieces and nephews, my granddaughter, is, hey, things weren't as immediate as we have it now, and it was the idea that we looked forward to getting the mail in the 50s and the 60s. I have my son in Minneapolis, who I introduced a minute ago. He doesn't even check his mailbox. I think that's probably true of a lot of people his age.
Yep.
And so, I said, I sent you something. Did you? Oh, I haven't checked the mail in a few days. But in those days, I can go from 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, but prior to that, the book starts in 1930. You look forward to the mail. That was your way
Yes.
to communicate. And especially when I was a student in Rome, and definitely no phone call. Well, I had one phone call a year, two maybe. People in the house would be writing letters to me, either my aunt, my uncle, my dad, my mom, and they didn't know when they were writing the letters. And as I say in the book, I picture them. My aunt and my mom typed their letters. Um, my dad hand wrote his letters. My uncle hand wrote his letters. So when I was transcribing those things into the book, I really felt like I could feel them either typing or writing and using
I
their
want you to
words.
explain what typing is compared to what we
Okay, all
just just
right.
just don't want to make an assumption that someone knows what that is.
Oh, wow, you are
Back
that's
up on that a little bit.
very astute. And probably making an assumption there that even some of our younger listeners would be. Typing is what we would refer to as word processing today, or typing into a keyboard. But in a keyboard, the keyboard is based. The keyboards we use in our computers are based on the typewriters of old. And if you study how we can go back to the printing press, I suppose, but in the 1400s. But I mean, if we want to go that far back, but just the idea that people had typewriters, and then even in the 50s and 60s, there was the evolution of manual typewriters by hand to electric typewriters. That was a big deal.
Yes.
And when I bought my first typewriter in college, I bought an electric
It
typewriter.
was big, it was
Yeah,
heavy.
heavy. And then in the offices, it was a big deal. And my mom typed from her office where she worked. From
And
those,
people were timed and you
uh,
were skilled if you could type
yes,
really fast without any errors. Yes.
yes, they called them, and one of the brands was the IBM Selectric, but it was a big typewriter. I still see them sometimes when I go to a print shop, or even some offices will still have them, because that's the only way the best way for them to print a label or something. But that's what a typewriter was. Thanks for your question. So part of what happened you said, where do these stories come from? Part of them come from these letters, and I was saying that sometimes the people would be writing, they didn't know they were writing letters to me at the same time and going to the post office to mail them, but I would get letters in my mailbox at college in Rome, and I would open them, and they would sort of be telling the same story, but from a different perspective. And I didn't really, I probably realized it at the time, but I didn't really realize it until 7 or 8, 9 years later. I mean, 9 years ago, when I started taking these 700 pages of letters and said, what am I going to do with these? And I decided to lay them out on a floor, and I sequenced them, and I put them in plastic tabs with a little sticker, like you have in your a little sticker like this on the side, which would note the date of the letter, and I'd have it in a plastic sleeve. And so once I got them organized, and then I started to read them sequentially, and that's where the characters of my family came out, where this different perspective, that I would read one letter and think, hey, that's the same thing mom talked about in the previous letter, but look at dad's take on this same situation. So and so when I had those letters, I thought, I've got to do something with these letters. I've been wanting to tell my family, and other people have been asking me, you've got to somebody's got to write this down about what it was like to live in a funeral home. And those letters have really helped propel me to say, all right, now is the time, and I'm gonna put this together. And so that's how after I retired from my profession and the Biden campaign and got into having more time, that's when I started putting the book together.
What do you think of the book, seeing it in print compared to what you envisioned it to
Mm,
become?
thrilling would be one word that comes to mind. It was quite a process. I had some good teachers, people that worked with me to help with the writing. I had done a lot of writing in my job as a teacher and a principal, so I wasn't and I got I wrote a thesis when I was at Berkeley. I wrote a master's thesis and a doctorate thesis, so I was no stranger to writing. So, but sitting down and telling stories and how do you do that? I had a lot of good coaching and people that I could feed off of, and making the decision not to approach this memoir sequential like some memoirs are. I approach it more thematically, and there's some intertwining themes. And to do that, and then doing the getting involved in the editing process, and then the book cover process when the person that was doing the cover design said, "You got any pictures of the house?" And I remembered this one because this was done in our house. The house in Elgin is periodically on what's called a house tour. A lot of towns have house tours of vintage houses. And so this was done for the house tour in 2009. And this artist had gone through other historical renditions of the house, and she put this sketch together. So it was I'll use the word thrill again. It was thrilling to contact her and introduce myself and ask, we were considering using your sketch as the cover of the book, and she was thrilled. So her name's Laura Ann Sanchez, and so she was thrilled to have it. And then the book club, the book cover designer Victoria Wolf. You can see it probably in the cover you have in your hand, but the background of the book, the background of the house, is the letters. So when you first glance at it, you think, oh, those are clouds. But when you look at it, it's I'd taken some of the letters and had a photographer help me just lay a lot of the letters out on a table, and then he took pictures to like a scattergram or a collage of the letters. So that forms the basis of the background. So it's because the letters tell the story. And so it was wonderful the way the book cover designer incorporated that all together. And that made when she first came up with her designs and started showing me, I thought, wow, that's incredible how you did that. And it gives me a tug to know that she helped that those elements of the book, not only my own stories and the concept of Two Floors Above Grief, but the role that the letters played in the storytelling and how she made it all come together. I was really happy with that. And then she asked me, "Do you have a picture of some of the family gathered?" And for the back of the book, when she was designing the back, and this was taken in 1993 when my uncle Lawrence passed away, and he was in his late 80s then, I believe. Yeah, we all gathered back at the house. The house that was there in the background, and took a picture there on the front lawn. So those at the time, those were many of the offspring that had been raised, or my generation and our kids were in that picture in 1993. So that was just representative of some of the. Now those people in the picture have gone on to have many more kids and grandchildren. We're up to over 100 now offspring of the
Wow.
house. Hmm. Hmm.
Speaking of, thank you for sharing that.
Hmm.
I want to read another section, if you don't mind, from the
Oh,
book.
love it, love it. Yeah. Hmm.
Okay. Dad and Lawrence designed and created an ambience in the business spaces with their clients in mind. They provided seating places that fostered the closeness of conversation. At times of grief, there are feelings of uncertainty and vulnerability. The atmosphere of the funeral home was intended to counteract and soothe those emotions. What comes to mind to you in rehearing that again?
When I'm hearing my own writing, I take my mind goes right back to the setting of the funeral home itself, and how one of the things that an undertaker does, and it'll be referred to with current funeral directors, when they meet with the family, they make arrangements. And during that time, when the family comes into the funeral home to meet with the funeral director, it's the funeral director's opportunity to get to know the family and to see how would they like their wake to be, what kind of atmosphere do they want to have, what kind of setting is it going to be. So Dad and Lawrence, and I know pretty sure that other undertakers do the same thing. They tailor that family's thinking into how they want to set the atmosphere. And if you go back in time, and I explain this a little bit in the book, when my uncle was starting his venture into the profession in 1930, it was at about the time that funerals were making the transition of being in the family home and moving into the funeral home. The thinking at the time in the 20s and the 30s was families didn't necessarily want to have that wake or that funeral in their own house, because then the feeling of that grief would become part of the house. So that's where part of where funeral homes came into play, because that became a way for families to experience um, the atmosphere that they would need to have the wake and the funeral, but that they can go back to their own house and not know that those final moments of the services weren't really in the walls of their own house. So going back to what I said in the book, so I know you've probably been to a fair amount of funeral homes and funeral homes yourself, and you know that pretty much the feeling is with uh, couches and chair arrangements, and more maybe chairs sitting along the wall, maybe, and the atmosphere of a funeral home is really usually flexible. You'll see if you go to a number of funerals at the same location, you'll notice that the setting changes, and that's because the funeral director is adapting the family's thinking. I talk in the book about how when it came time to have a wake service or a funeral service that was a little more formal, well, then you would have chairs and rows. And Dad was pretty, based on the family, Dad was pretty astute at letting my brother and I know how many chairs to set up. And he wanted to put it in such, I think I realized this later, not so much as a 10-year-old setting up chairs, but the idea being that if you put too many chairs up and people didn't come to fill those chairs, the family might feel, oh, nobody came. On the other hand, if he set fewer chairs up than he thought might be needed, then as more people came, then our assignment was to go get more chairs and set them up.
Mm.
And so it was sort of a way to accommodate that grief, to also if you set too many chairs up and people didn't come to fill them, that may have intensified the grief. If you did it the other way, it helped the family to breathe a little differently and say, "Ah, look who came," and boy, they came too. And so there was that. There, it's a psychological. It's
Yes.
physiological. It's emotional. It's psychological. And so what Dad and I'll go to my mom's funeral in 2010. We had it at the house there, and what I call the old part of the house, and the sliding doors were open to the stairway that led up to the apartments. And so when the people came to her wake, the people moved around freely, and some would go in that outer area, the parlor vestibule area where there was a lot of chairs and couches and stuff too, and sort of started to spread in their own conversations to the stairs that led up to where Mom raised her family and where she lived, and where she lived for over 40 years. So I think that was, ways that a funeral home can adapt itself to a family's situation, and you want to make it comfortable. You want to make it so there's conversation, and there's a story I've learned from one of the people that interviewed me, and for this book, for a podcast. He's an undertaker. He talks about the story and how important the story is. And that is, the way he explained it is, when you gather for a wake or a funeral, usually the conversation will, so how did it happen? How did they die? And that story, whatever the origins of that story were, that gets repeated. Yeah, it may not be the same every time, but it gets repeated. And so the story is very important in those days of grief, not only for the family, but it's important for the people who come to show their respects.
Yes.
Because if it comes up intentionally to hold a story, or just in conversation, that story gets repeated. And this particular host of the podcast was just saying, an undertaker himself, how important that is in the ritual. And I had never really thought about that until I was engaged with him in this conversation, and how much a part of the grieving process this story is. And I think, I don't know if he said it there, but I'm thinking off the top of my head too. Even if a person's been dead 20 years, people will still come back. Well, how did they die? And so that
Yes.
story repeats itself. And no matter where a person is in the grief process, um, it's the story gets repeated, and how
Absolutely. It's
important
the
that is
first
in the
thing that people
process.
ask you. It's no matter how long it is, when, how, those are instant questions. I would agree.
I don't know if it's come up in your podcast before, but I'm sure you know Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the seven stages of grief. And this,
It used to be five, that is changing and evolving. And
well,
the concept
yes,
also that grief is not this nice little cute line that
no,
goes.
and I don't know,
But I
maybe I
think
was
when that
just,
first came out, there was this concept that you would do this, and then this step would happen, and then this would
yeah.
happen afterwards. As we evolved, just like the diversity training was not something that you and I experienced in our youth, and as we learn
Mm-hmm.
and evolve, it's all over the place. You can have all those in 1 hour.
And I think that there, as I've learned, and I always, I appreciated reading Kubler-Ross when she first published, and in the years since. But I think a different way of thinking now is, hey, there's not a stage of grief, because when you think about a stage, it's something that has a beginning and an end.
Yes,
There isn't. You could talk about the seven stages, but the one you thought, you never finish one, it might pop up 5 or 6 years later. So
absolutely.
if you call them stages, they're moving, they're fluid, they're
Yes.
moving around, and I just I'm just embedding that thinking in the last 5, 6 weeks in my head. I'm learning so much since I wrote the book, and getting different perspectives. But just thinking that it isn't finite. Grief isn't
No,
finite steps. It's something, and from your own experiences too. This, when you think you've cleared a hurdle in your experience, something will trigger, and you go back and revisit it again, and there it is.
absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for listening to some of our podcasts. I appreciate that. I know I've covered a few points in the book. Was there anything in the book that you particularly wanted to bring out?
Well, I wanted to, since the concept of and I appreciate, I'm so glad you asked me to be your guest. And and as you and I have talked before, the theme of your podcast is based on the concept of widowhood, but in general, loss. And I don't share this story in the book, but when my dad died in '84, um, my mom was 67 or 68 at the time. And yeah, she had 26 years of widowhood. But I remember, and probably didn't talk to her as much about it, as just was with her a lot, and how she just moved on with her life, and things. But I remember an incident at my niece's wedding in 1992. So Dad had been dead 8 years, and yeah, there was a reception and the dancing and the things that go on at a wedding. And I wanted to I went over to my mom, hey, let's go dance. And she was really, no, I don't want to dance. And I may have asked her a second time, and she was, I do not want to dance. And so I did. I was probably later that, soon after that, I say, well, hey, everything okay, Mom? What's going on? And she said, since your dad died, and they were tremendous dancers. In fact, I devote a chapter to their dancing, because they dance through life. I call that chapter Dancing Through Life, because they were just they were the kind of people that when they got on a dance floor, people would stop and watch them
Mm,
because they were very fluid. And you never, yeah, you know that dad was leading, but you never felt that way. It was just they were one. And so what she explained to me, I'm thinking about her experience with widowhood. One of the things she wasn't ready to do 8 years after he died was um, I said, I can't do it. She said, when people dance and I watch people dance, I want your dad to be here. And I just can't do it. Even with you, my son, he said, I can't do it. But she evolved. Um, in 1996, my brothers and I took my mom away. We took her on a trip for 3 days uh, to celebrate her 80th birthday. And went to this one establishment a couple nights, and there was dancing there. She danced with all three of us at different times.
mm,
So whether there was dancing in between that, but then after that time, when other family events came up, um, another another wedding, that she got up and did the chicken dance with us at another one of her grandchildren's weddings, and we had to keep her up or she fell. I think she fell down. So she was up participating and doing it. So, I mean, I think when we haven't talked too much about, widowhood, because I myself haven't had that experience, but just looking at it from my mom and those 26 years that she had and how this decision she made and the times in her own widowhood where she might have had a think she might like to go on a date and how she went through different processes and how she pretty much surrounded herself with many, many friends and just created this different life for herself without my dad. But and I'm the few times I've listened to your broadcast when you focus more on that with your guest, uh, there's there is just as many ways to approach widowhood as there are to approach grief. There is no
yes,
prescription. Um, there's no guide. There's plenty of help books and
yes.
conversations and support groups, but I think each individual, when they're in that state of life, they have to take all those resources and figure out, how am I going to do this? And so I think that's just when I think about your broadcast and what you're providing for people in terms of their own grief journeys. I think that's so important and so vital to keep the conversation flowing. And the idea that we talk about grief now more than we did when my dad and uncle first started the funeral home business in the 30s. I don't think people were as comfortable now talking about it as they are now, 90 some years later. But
Mm.
I think it's healthy that we have outlets like you or the book I wrote or all the other books that are out there about grief, and support groups. I met somebody at my high school reunion last week who runs some support groups near our hometown for people who, she herself and her husband lost an adult son, and that's what
Oh,
got her involved. But she said just that's what she's doing with her life now. She's facilitating different grief support groups and helping people and that journey. I think that's other ways that we can help each other.
thank you for mentioning that. And the word widowhood, I think we may have spoken before our pre-podcast. I chose that word intentionally because oftentimes we are thinking of that widow or widower, but being from Chicago, that hood part is family. And that widow and widower is impacted by the death of their spouse, but everyone around them encompassing in that community, in that hood, obviously the death of your dad and your mom, um, trying to support them who was left or what your life looks like in their absence. Your friends are impacted by the death of your parents because your friends care about you. Your
Hmm.
physician is part of that hood because the grief impacts your health and your well-being. Things you have to do financially, legally, all those things impact our lives when someone dies close to us or sub close to us because we become part of that hood. So the conversation about, two floors above grief, someone's listening to this and going, I never thought about the family of the funeral home director, and they're human too, and what that perspective. And that's why I thought, having this conversation, the podcast brings it from a different angle. No, it's not a self-help on how to deal with grief, but it's just seeing those people that are supporting you in that very difficult time, what their family perspective looked like, and to just see it from a different angle, because I've not seen this type of discussion that you present in this book from someone else bringing it from this. Like you said, it's usually someone that is talking about the business of a funeral home, not so much
Hmm.
as the family dynamics and everything
Yeah,
involved in that. So I thought that
yeah.
was unique.
No, and I thanks for bringing that up. And I think one of the things I've become more attuned to, not so much in the writing of the book or even living that life, um, but becoming more aware of, and in discussions I've had with people in the funeral home industry. Um, what is an undertaker, a funeral director, an embalmer? What do they do with their grief? How do they, after the profession is really one of servitude. So when you're there to serve the people who are directly involved in the loss, and you take a part of yourself to help their journey, and in that you become an undertaker. I know this was likely true of my dad and uncle. They become emotionally involved. How can you not be when you get acquainted with a family who's experiencing this? So, but what do they do with that grief? What do they do with the grief that they've taken on, that I'll use the word burden. They've tried to take on the burden for the family, to make the arrangements, to arrange with the cars and the limousines and the anything else you need, the minister, the cemetery rent. The undertaker, that's their job, undertake all that from the family. Um, but where do they put that when they're feeling all those emotions? I think my dad was a piano player and music, loved music and playing cards. I think that was one of his ways to do it. My uncle, as I've unpacked this more lately, he used to take, sometimes announced, sometimes unannounced, 2 or 3 day trips, and he would just go. And I think now that I look back at it, maybe that was a coping mechanism or some way that he just needed. He would say, "I need to get away."
Yes,
So he would say that. Now that I come to think of it, I need to get away. I'm getting away. And so that idea, uh, he didn't need a whole vacation, or maybe he did, but within the element of the timing, he just, I need to get away. And I think he really couldn't process maybe that grief of the family, the client family, especially if it was a family that he knew. How do you process that? He gets away. And I think, and I've had this discussion with others in the industry that say, hey, maybe there's an idea they think currently we need to address our own needs as undertakers and as funeral directors. How do we take care of our own mental health? And they're not really talking about situations in their own family where there's a death. They're talking about, well, that's another issue, but talking about what do you do in your profession to take care of yourself. Uh, you know, and I think that's a subject I'm pursuing with some of the others in the industry right now, to see what kind of things are going on, or what kind of help can be provided. Is there a way that the stories in the book might help in that area? So that,
certainly, because they definitely need to have their own self-care. You cannot pour out of an empty cup. So needing to
no,
be there and taking that weight from other people, you have to have some place to dispense it. So that is very
I
logical.
like that what you said. You cannot pour out of an empty cup. That's beautiful. Hmm.
Thank you. I
Hmm.
I know you've been able to give us a lot of your time today. Um, any questions you have of me?
Um, well, yeah, questions. Well, I'll comment first. I just appreciate how you prepared for this, and I know I was happy to send you a copy of the book, and how you got into it, and framed so much of the our discussion on things that are right in the book, and that led it. And also, I like another comment I give to you as a host is this how you engaged and from talk to me, not just about the book, but the other part. There's that. Like I said earlier, this is only one part of me.
Yes.
It's sort of similar to what when I'm doing the work with LGBTQ families, and sometimes people will want to make your whole identity that you're gay or that you're lesbian or
Oh, okay.
any one of those labels. And I think it's always better. I always like to say, hey, that's just part. I'm I'm a this much a
Yes, I'm a
person,
whole person.
and I happen to be gay. So it's the same thing. I think, yeah, I'm an author of this book, Two Floors Above the Grief, but I happen to, have had 50 years in education, and
Yes.
50 years of teaching and being a principal and being a curriculum coordinator and other things. And I think as the older I get, and the more, and when I talk to people like yourself, we all have a lot to bring to the table. And I think that's very appreciative. And a question that I might have for you is, so you said you have a couple other podcasts today. So what's one of your other focuses in today's work that you're going to be interviewing people?
So actually, my first podcast this morning was from Noemi.
Oh
We
yeah,
yes,
we know Naomi. Okay.
yes, I spoke with her, and she shared about how she used her art skills to manage grief. She also talked about how music was beneficial for her and sharing some of her grief journey. I wanted to talk with Noemi because oftentimes in the loss of a spouse or someone close to you, life no longer looks the same, and you have to create a new life. In this virtual platform that we're living in now, people are changing what they're doing with life. So to hear how someone restructured their life in midst of COVID can be helpful for
Mm,
someone that has a spouse that has died and they may have to re-enter the workplace and they may have fears and anxiety as they're dealing with the death of their spouse and now needing to re-enter the workplace, and having a conversation with her proved beneficial to that. um, I'm actually the guest on someone else's podcast later today, and just a couple of other conversations, just talking to someone for the first time because um, things have. I'm really done with recording podcasts for 2023, and now trying to see what 2024 looks like and where to take this. Widowhood Real Talk with Tina is um, the podcast is one portion of our organization. We are a 501c3 nonprofit with the mission of supporting people who are grieving. And we actually have a goal for 2023 to connect with 2 million people because our world is coming out of a pandemic, and we have a cultural way of grieving that many people were not able to honor, and they have lost loved ones privately. They've had
hmm.
to just figure out how to keep going, but may have not had an opportunity to really have community support them in their grief. So, Widowhood Real Talk with Tina, we support people in three different ways. One is through social content, which is putting inspirational, encouraging information on 6 different social media platforms, and also with our weekly podcast. And that podcast that you mentioned can be a conversation with someone sharing their personal grief journey, or also someone that may be a therapist, someone that may be a supervisor talking about how you manage grief in the workplace,
Yeah.
or a financial person, because going back to that hood concept, it's not that family dynamics or the people community involved impacts grief in different ways. The second thing that we do, we try to connect people with good resources. um, People having to find a therapist online, we have some therapists that work with people throughout the world in different locations, or somebody may be in a particular state. We also have a author, and we work with them to have their book to give to people that have recently lost a loved one. because
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
navigating that, like you said, we don't always talk about grief and how do I deal with this? And so having a book that can be helpful is impactful. The third item in that making of community, we try to have events that help people know that they're not alone. In the month of August, we're having a walk for love where we're asking people from August 6th to the 12th to walk for 1 mile. And then at the end of that, take a picture of yourself, the scenery, your shoes, and put hashtag walk for love, hashtag WRTWT. Because when you're grieving, it's hard to do the simplest tasks. And just to know that other people are walking with you may encourage somebody else to leave their house and to go for a walk and know that I'm not alone in pressing in doing this. In
Mm-hmm.
September, we're having days of inspiration where we're asking people for 3 days to put up their favorite quote, put hashtag days of inspiration, hashtag WRTWT, because people need to be inspired. They need to know that they are not alone in this journey.
Wow.
And
Yeah,
then
please
and
let
then
me
in
know how I can be a
October,
part of that. Yeah, let me
oh,
know how I can be a
sure,
part of it.
thank
Yeah.
you.
Mm-hmm.
And in October, we're having a mental health webinar where we're talking about how to manage grief during the holidays. Because when you're grieving, everybody's all ha ha ha, and it just double downs on how you feel about the death of your loved one. So we have four mental health professionals that are making themselves available to be on Zoom. That is a $20 fee because there's a lot of cost involved in
Mm-hmm.
that, but that
Mm-hmm.
is
Oh yeah.
very small compared to the information that you're getting. So it's jam packed in 1 hour to some breakout rooms. We're asking people to submit questions in advance. The ticket sale actually starts for that in a couple of weeks on August 6th to make that available. So, trying to think of all those different things to continually do to help people know that they are not alone in this process that's very complicated.
Oh, wow. That's quite an endeavor you've got going. That's going to be helpful to a lot of people. A lot
I
of
am
people.
excited. The board members are very supportive. And when you have a non, so a lot of people think it's just a podcast, but it's like, and I also forgot to mention, we do have a private Facebook group where we have peer support meetings once a month. And we also have a book club where we talk about a book about grief, asking questions and encouraging each other to be able to have a safe space to talk about what this looks like for them.
Great. Thanks. Thanks for and I knew parts of that, I think, but boy, I'm glad I asked that question because I learned a lot myself, and I hope the listeners to this particular podcast will take some of that, will take that information with them
Yeah.
to be on their own grief journey. I think we're all on a grief journey. I mean,
Yes.
yeah, it doesn't uh yeah, I know we're all on a grief journey because depending on doesn't sometimes it's more immediate, sometimes it's
Yes.
just yeah, it's all on a grief journey.
I
Yeah.
have two more
Yeah.
questions for you.
Oh wow. Okay, go ahead.
What gives you joy these days, Kevin?
What do I do what?
What gives you joy?
What gives me joy? Okay. Um what gives me joy is spending time with my husband, with Leon. We have a very excellent relationship and just spending time together. We never ever run out of things to do or to do together, even if it's being quiet together. So that certainly gives me joy. The other part that gives me joy is a couple things. Is just the joy I feel in watching and being part of my granddaughters' lives. You know, just how they're experiencing life. And Leon's six granddaughters have welcomed me. They call me Da, which is a derivative of an Irish name for grandfather. So they're very inclusive of me, and that brings me joy. The other thing that brings me joy is continuing to be a part of the communication and the connection with people that I've known my whole life. So last week's class reunion will be one point in time, 55 years. And knowing that I still am able, still have the ability physically
Yes.
and still have the wherewithal and the desire to be with people, to reacquaint myself. And going even farther, one of my next one of the writing projects I have on the table is well, it's getting to the table. It's not quite there yet. But what I really I take a lot of pleasure and enjoyment in the students that I've had the opportunity to be a teacher for, and the students that I've had the opportunity to be a principal for. So one of the things I want to do is further connect with them, to learn from them about what was it. I want to be a help to other teachers and principals with this, is and give my hand, provide some joy for me as well as others, is to say what, looking back over some of my students now, yeah, this year would be, yeah, 50. I started student teaching 50 years ago. So some of those students I had, it's been 50 years. And with we talked about how we didn't have social media along that. That's part of the premise of the book. But with the gift of social media, I want to see how many of those former students I can get in contact with from a teacher point of view or from when I was a principal. And what is it that they take away from those experiences? What was I like to think of the concept of you throw oatmeal against a wall. This was an analogy that I've heard it, but it was a gift from one of my superintendents when he set us out one year and said, okay, we're gonna throw those oatmeal against the wall to start the school year. What's gonna stick by the end? What idea, what technique, what relationship? So I want to explore the joy of what those former students still have or don't
Mm,
have, because even if they don't have a memory, or even if they come across with a memory that maybe is less than positive, I want to be able to use that information to inform today's teachers, and to say, here's some things that I experienced starting in 1978, and here's the feedback from the actual people that I was able to assemble, to say, what do they remember? So I want to translate that into current teachers to say, what can you do now that will make a difference on your students 50 years from now? What are they going to carry with them? And I know
the
the idea of,
cliche answer.
yeah, and I know the idea of, so that I think there's joy in teaching, there's joy in learning. There's also people that have had difficulty with it, or they've had difficult school experiences, either from a teacher point of view or from a student point of view. But I want to build on that. And this book is more, what do we do with family documents? What do we do with, how do we make those come alive? With From an education, a professional point of view, I want to do what I want to leave something for teachers and principals to say, based on what we know about this one person's experience and the students that wrote back to them, what what can we learn from that to incorporate into our own teaching nowadays?
You're
And
trying to shape
no,
education in the future and what that looks like based on what they've been
yeah,
able to recall. Nice.
knowing that classrooms and things, there's schools and classrooms certainly look a lot different now than when I started in 1974. On the other hand, there's still constants that run through that. There's some constant elements that run through that are still impactful. So I'm in the process now of contacting some of my former advisors when I was getting my master's and doctorate degree to help me formulate the essential couple of essential questions that I want to be able to ask in this survey. So that's just that's what's been spurring me on, and with the I know you ask about joy,
No,
but
no, that's fine. You have
that
a
that is
second
joy.
question. I have it
It
written
is a
down, so
joy.
I'm coming for
Okay, so that's part of what
it.
that's
Okay.
what's given me joy in what I talked about, family and friends, and joy in being able to have the capacity still, and to maybe to help impact some future generations as well.
Okay. Nice. Thank you. Second question, and I'll make this my final.
Okay.
If you could pick any age range to talk to younger Kevin, what would it be and what would you tell him?
Whoa, let's see. Any age range. I got a few, few age ranges.
Go for it. You can pick
Yeah,
a
no, I mean,
couple.
I
You
mean,
can
I
pick
have a
one
number of,
or a couple.
I have a number of age ranges. Um, okay, one that comes to mind. I would go back to um 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old Kevin. And in the book, I talk about some of the things that kept me from participating with my peers. And part of that was I didn't think that I was athletically inclined, and I was very self-conscious as whether it be baseball or basketball or golf or whatever my peers were doing, and I would find ways to stay away. I would use other skills to be a friend to these people, to these guys and girls and things. But if I would tell my younger self not to be afraid of it, to participate more, to have some more resilience in terms of what kind of comments I might hear or perceive I'm hearing about my own ability. Um, I would do more getting on the basketball and just playing. And to this day, I don't know. I'm really uncomfortable dribbling a basketball. Here I am, 73. But if I'd only allowed myself those experiences with peers at the time and hadn't made myself so self-conscious or insecure about it at the time, I think I'd feel better about that. I mean, things play out for a reason, but when you asked that question, that was one thing. If I was sitting on my 13 or 14-year-old, 15-year-old shoulder, 16, 17-year-old shoulder, I'd say, get in there, just go do it. What do you got to lose? I mean, that's the kind of attitude I have now. But I would just say, what do you got to lose? Just do it. These people are still going to be your friends. I mean, I have the benefit of time to look back and say those people that I'm talking about, I'm still friendly with. So at the time, I think I was thinking, hey, if you get in there and show that you don't have those skills, they're not going to be your friend anymore. I don't think that's going to be true. So I would I would say now to kids who are that age, if they asked, I wouldn't intrude unless they asked, but I would say to kids that get in there. If you're asking me, what would you do, Kev? I'd get in there and I'd play. I'd get in there and I'd let myself have fun. So that's what I'm thinking.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for joining the Widowhood. I will let you wrap up with any maybe final thoughts or comments that you'd like to do.
Oh, final thoughts. Well, this has been a wonderful, wonderful podcast. Very thorough, very easy. And you said this that it was very informal and very comfortable, and you certainly made it that way. And I enjoyed spending the time with you. Or we could go on and on and on, but you've got to get on to your things, and I'm going on with my day as well. But I mean, closing thoughts. I just encourage people to. To take an interest in the book, pick, you can do it on Kindle or do it on a paperback. The Audible version is coming out October 1st. So I've been going through the process now of working with a narrator to get it all set and ready to go, and I'm excited about that. Um, and I think, based on conversations I've had with you, and I've learned so much since I wrote the book and since I published it, that I think the book has a lot of potential for not just kids that grew up in a funeral home. There's not that many of us, but for other people and families and family with family stories. And I'm just keep encouraging people to explore it and give themselves the opportunity to pick up the book. So and I think it's going to come in your show notes, but it's available on Amazon or at my website and bookstores. If you can walk into any bookstore and ask for it, and they have a way to order it, so they can do that. So that's my closing thought.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you for being a part of our hood. Thank you for allowing me and my guests to be with you on this journey. I know it is hard. Every day comes up with these different challenges, but I want to say thank you for showing up. Thank you for keep believing. Thank you for keep trying. And I hope that this conversation has been insightful for you. I appreciate Kevin talking about his life, his experiences, how you maybe can normalize and see the people that have helped you on the funeral service side and just see life from a different perspective. Thank you for being here. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for spending another episode with Widowhood Real Talk. If you found the contents of today helpful, share the episode to anyone you know who may need it. Subscribe to the show and tune into Widowhood Real Talk each week. Then visit widowhood-realtalkwithtina.org to join the community and access additional resources. Remember, you are not alone in this journey.